Okay, so we are live, folks. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. If you could somebody just put a confirmation in the chat that you can hear us, that would be much appreciated. Sounds good. Thank you very much, Love Guru. Jack and Multi-Tom Tom, thank you. So I'm here today, and it's always a great pleasure to be joined by Professor Costas Lapavitsas. He is our resident expert for our Global Economy Report. For those of you who aren't familiar with Professor Lapavitsas, he's a professor of economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. In Greece's January 2015 general election, he was elected to Greece's parliament as a member of the left-wing Syriza party. In August of that year, however, after the former Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras capitulated to the austerity demands of Greece's troika of creditors and ignored the result of a momentous referendum in Greece against austerity, Kostas defected to a new party called Popular Unity. His many books include The Left Case Against the EU and Crisis in the Eurozone, and his most recent book, an excellent study of capitalism, is called The State of Capitalism, and it explores how capitalism has produced grotesque inequality, ruinous financial bubbles, and planetary destruction. And I think, Kostas, it's a very timely book given what's transpiring in the world today. Thank you for joining us again on Reason to Resist.
My pleasure, Dimitri.
So a couple of, one disclaimer I want to just share with our audience, and that is, this is the first live stream we're doing on Reason to Resist without our comrade, Rami Yahya. Rami arrived in the People's Republic of China about a day or two ago. He's suffering from a terrible case of jet lag. He's there in part to do reporting for Reason to Resist. So I'm hoping that I'm not going to botch this. So far, it seems like we're going smoothly, but I ask you for your patience if at any point I get it wrong, the technical aspects of this. And as we announced yesterday on social media, the purpose of today's live stream is to examine the current state of this calamitous tariff war that Trump has unleashed. And before I get into it with Kostas, who's going to provide us, I'm sure, with some excellent insights into what is going on, the whole thing has been so chaotic that I think it would be useful for me just to spend a few minutes telling you about the timeline. From the time of Trump's inauguration in January 20th of this year to the current time, what has transpired in the tariff war. So I hope you could bear with me here and that I'm going to get this right. So the timeline is on the screen, and it begins with, of course, the inauguration day when Trump promises to tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens. He said he expects to put 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico starting on February 1st. 6 days later, Trump threatens 25% tariffs on all Colombia imports and other retaliatory measures after President Gustavo Petro rejects 2 U.S. military aircraft carrying migrants to the country, accusing Trump of not treating immigrants with dignity during deportation. They worked out that spat to Trump's satisfaction, apparently. February 1st, Trump signs an executive order to impose tariffs on imports from Mexico, Canada, and China, 10% on all imports from China, and 25% on imports from Mexico and Canada starting February 4th. On the 3rd of February, Trump agrees to a 30-day pause on his tariff threats against Mexico and Canada. So this is the day before they were supposed to come into effect. On the 4th, the day they were supposed to come into effect, these 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada, Trump's new 10% tariffs on all Chinese imports go into effect. China retaliates the same day by announcing a flurry of countermeasures, including sweeping new duties on a variety of American goods and an anti-monopoly investigation into Google. On the 10th of February, Trump announces plans to hike steel and aluminum tariffs starting March 12th. He removes the exemptions from his 2018 tariffs on steel meaning that all steel imports will be taxed at a minimum of 25%. February 13th, Trump announces a plan for what he calls reciprocal tariffs, promising to increase U.S. tariffs to match the tax rates that other countries charge on imports for purposes of fairness. On the 4th of March, Trump's 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico go into effect. Though he limits the levy to 10% on Canadian energy, he also doubles the tariff on all Chinese imports to 20%. All three countries, Canada, Mexico, and China, promise retaliation. March 5th, Trump grants a 1-month exemption on his new tariffs impacting goods from Mexico and Canada for U.S. automakers. The following day, he postpones 25% tariffs on many imports from Mexico and some imports from Canada for a month, but he still plans to impose reciprocal tariffs starting on April 2nd. On the 10th of March, China's retaliatory 15% tariffs on key American farm products take effect. On March 24th, Trump says he will replace a 25% tariff on all imports from any country that buys oil or gas from Venezuela. In addition to impose, he will place, I should say, I thought I said replace, he will place a 25% tariff on buyers of Venezuelan oil, in addition to imposing new tariffs on Venezuela itself starting April 2nd. The tariffs would most likely add to the taxes facing China, which in 2023 bought 68% of the oil exported by Venezuela. March 26, Trump says he's placing 25% tariffs on auto imports. April 2nd, Trump announces his long-promised reciprocal tariffs, declaring a 10% baseline tax on imports across the board starting April 5th, as well as higher rates for dozens of nations that run trade surpluses with the U.S. to take effect April 9th. April 3rd, Trump's previously announced auto tariffs begin. April 4th, China announces plans to impose a 34% tariff on imports of all U.S. products beginning April 10th. On April 5th, Trump's 10% minimum tariff on nearly all countries and territories take effect. On April 9th, Trump's higher reciprocal rates go into effect, hiking taxes on imports from dozens of countries just after midnight. But hours later, his administration says it will suspend most of these higher rates for 90 days while maintaining the recently imposed 10% levy on nearly all global imports. April 10th, the White House clarifies that Trump's previously announced 125% figure for tariffs against China is actually 145%, once his previous 20% fentanyl tariffs are accounted for. On April 11th, China says it will raise tariffs on U.S. goods from 84% to 125% in response to Trump's heightened levies, with the new rate set to begin on the 12th of April. So that would have been Saturday, this past Saturday. And then, to top it all off, on April 12th, a U.S. customs notice revealed smartphones, computers, and some other electronic devices would be excluded from the 125% tariff on goods entering the United States from China. But then, in a late-breaking development, Donald Trump chimed in on social media saying that there was no exemption for these products and called such reports about this notice false. Instead, he said that, quote, they are just moving to a different tariff bucket. So when he said they, presumably he was referring to the smartphones and computers and other electronic devices. And then Trump added, quote, we are taking a look at semiconductors and the whole electronic supply chain in the upcoming national security tariff investigations. Trump said he would provide an update on Monday, that's today, about semiconductor duties. Everyday devices, just so you understand, such as smartphones and laptops, rely on semiconductors, which are small and powerful pieces of tech that form the basic building blocks of modern computation. I'm sorry to burden you with all of that detail, but I think it is essential background information to the discussion that Costas and I are going to have today. So with that, Costas, in our prior discussions, you've quite properly asked repeatedly when we've talked about tariffs, and I think we've had 3 discussions about them up until now, whether there is a method to this madness. On the surface, it does certainly look like madness. As you sit here now, after nearly 3 months of Trump's second administration, Do you see any method in this madness, Costas?
Dimitri, I have to say that just listening to you, I got dizzy. Just the succession of steps, counter steps, retreats, reversals, that by itself tells you something very important, that there is nothing coherent, systematic, and consistent in place in the United States. And the current administration, to a large extent, makes policy by the pants of its seat. I mean, by the seat of its pants. So it's chaotic. Now, is there method in the madness? No. Tariffs are a respectable, legitimate means of economic policy, for sure. It's a tool. But what they've done is to make it look ridiculous, to create incredible uncertainty, and that has rebounded against the United States economy already. If there is any kind of logic, it's very remote, and I'm sure that we will discuss it when we get into it in some depth. But, a set of statements that follow from each other logically doesn't make a plan. And Trump doesn't have a plan. He's got some ideas, some suggestions, and he's making it up as he's going along. The end result will not be positive.
Now, the former finance minister of Greece, who at the time he was finance minister, was sitting in the Greek parliament with you, Yanis Varoufakis, has argued that there is, in fact, some method to this madness and that Trump does have a plan. Whether it'll be effective or not, I think that Yanis may not have a firm position on that, but he does believe there is a coherent plan behind this chaos. Could you summarize for us, Costas, what is Yanis's view on this, and how do you assess his analysis?
I am not sure I understand exactly what Yanis's view is on this. He should be asked directly, really. He has been arguing that Trump has a plan, and the plan has to do with the dollar, and it has to do with reducing the value of the dollar in order to boost the productive capacity, the domestic productive capacity of the United States. I think that is there, and again, I'm sure we'll discuss it in more detail as we move along. But that doesn't a plan make. That is just an intention, an idea, a wish on the part of the Trump team, but that there's no plan. To achieve that aim, boosting the domestic productive capacity of the United States industry and so on, you need a lot more than simply focus on bringing down the value of the dollar. That does require a plan. And that plan would have a lot of steps and serious social transformation. There's none of that. None of that. And I don't think that the Trump team even understands it. In fact, the more I look at the Trump team, the more I have the impression that it's not just the B team. Here's the C team, or whatever it is that is running the United States. It's a bunch of people who barely comprehend what's at issue and how much disturbance they've caused. It's basically second-raters. And whatever actions they're taking and whatever thinking they're putting into place is the thinking and actions of second-raters. And I'm happy to explain that as we move along. It's a disaster the way it's unfolding at the moment.
So speaking of the C team, I'd like to show you a clip from a member of the C team, the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, in a recent appearance before the adoring crowd at the American Bankers Association. Here's what Mr. Bessent had to say.
Escalation, unfortunately, the biggest offender in the global trading system is China, and they're the only country who's escalated. And I can tell the rest of the world that I'm not sure whether it was the prime minister or the economic minister in Spain made some comments this morning, oh, well, maybe we should align ourselves more with China. That would be cutting your own throat, because I can tell you that these Chinese exports that the U.S. tariff wall is going to keep out that China, for all of you who can remember that Disney movie of the brooms carrying the buckets of water, that is the Chinese business model. It never stops. They just keep producing and producing and dumping, and it's going somewhere. And I think, Rob, at the end of the day, that we can probably reach the ideal with our allies, with the other countries that have been long-term. They've been good military allies, not perfect economic allies, and then we can approach China as a group.
I have to confess, Costas, I didn't see the movie with the brooms carrying the buckets of water. I don't know what the hell that has to do with this Tariff War, but I'm sure Scott Besson understands that work of cinematic art better than I do. In any case, there's so much in there to unpack. I mean, the first thing is, I just want to, this notion that China is dumping, that it just produces masses of products and will sell them anywhere at whatever price they can fetch to destroy the competition. I mean, do you think there's any validity to this accusation that's being leveled against China?
The only validity there is that Chinese capitalism has overtaken US capitalism by a mile now. That's the only validity there is to it. Through a combination of domestic and international factors at play for at least 2 decades and probably longer, China has emerged as the workshop of the world. That's the truth of it. Most of the explanation has to do with the domestic structures of social and economic power in China, and I'm happy to discuss them as we move along. The United States has been very clear about defending its hegemonic position in the world, economically, militarily, and politically for decades. They realize that they're falling behind, and therefore they are attacking China for all they can. This is really what's happening with the Trump plan, and this man expresses it. That's not new, incidentally. Some of us have got long memories. I began to do economics and to look into Asia in detail back in the 80s when Japan was the main enemy. And the United States establishment was very clear at that time that Japan was the worst thing that had ever happened, that the Japanese were dumping goods, that they were cheating, that they were doing this, that, and the other. And they took measures which constrained Japan, and Japan hasn't really recovered in 30 years. What's happening now is that this man, who is actually a man of Wall Street, that's how he made his name and his fortune, is expressing the deepest desires and aims of the Trump administration. They think that they can beat China, they can put it back in the box, and maintain the hegemonic position of US capitalism in the world. He needs to think again. China is not Japan, politically and economically, and what they're attempting to do will damage the US economy, not only the Chinese economy. They will do China some damage with what they're doing, and I'm happy to discuss it, but they will also damage the US economy.
And there's this simpleton's analysis of why China has been able to become such a powerhouse in industrial production and international trade, is that first of all, they exploit cheap labor, whereas labor costs are higher, in the so-called civilized world, and that they steal intellectual property from these extraordinarily sophisticated Western corporate actors. How do you respond to that? And I realize this is a big question, a complex question, but what do you think primarily accounts for the enormous success that China has had in terms of international trade and industrial production?
China emerged and remains a developing country. People forget that. China has got a huge population, and there are many Chinas, right? There's a very, very advanced part of the economy in the big cities and so on, but there are parts of China which are developing country areas. China then emerged as a developing country through its transformation and social change, which we don't really want to get into. And it followed in many ways the path of developing countries. If you don't protect, you will never make it in the world economy. The idea that somehow these people, the Americans or the British or the Germans, will do you favors it doesn't hold. You've got to succeed. You've got to use and marshal domestic resources, and you've got somehow to protect your economic activity in order to succeed and achieve what you wish to achieve. China did that. It certainly protected its economy. It certainly controls parts of the economy. It certainly controls flows of capital. It controls the banking system. It controls large, big businesses. The core, the backbone of the Chinese economy is state-owned, state-operated enterprises. The economy is capitalistic, no doubt at all about it, and it has a large private component, but the backbone remains under state control, even if it operates capitalistically. And behind all that is the Communist Party of China, which is not the Communist Party politically. People make that point as if they're making an ideological statement. It's not. It just calls itself the Communist Party. It doesn't operate in a communist way. It runs the economy, and it runs it in a coherent, managed way. That's the significance of the Communist Party of China. It's 100 million people roughly, and they call the shots. They dictate how the market moves. That is a big secret of success. Big secret of success in China. Obviously, to go forward, they took advantage of low wages, of course, as they moved millions and millions of peasants essentially into the big cities. That has been the classic pattern of capitalist development. China did it on a grand scale, and therefore it moved millions of people out of poverty. They took advantage, therefore, of low wages, but they also invested enormously. The other secret of Chinese success is investment. For years, Chinese investment was 40, 45, 50% of GDP. Unthinkable volumes for Western countries. The combination of low wages and huge investment has transformed the country. At the moment, China is still not really in the high technology bracket for much of what it does, but it's moving very rapidly there. And that's not because of cheating or stealing or things like that, although the Chinese are not, leery of doing it when they can. But the way in which they're moving up the technology ladder is through investment and through marshalling the national resources, universities, research centers, and so on. Again, through the guidance of the state backed by the Communist Party. That managed capitalism. That's basically what it is.
Right.
And it's very exploitative, I should say. It has created a lot of rich people, and it has increased social inequality, of course, but it has transformed the country.
So going back to the character who talked about the flying brooms, Scott Bessent, he also suggested that if the United States' former allies in the West joined forces against China, they could bring China to heel. I just want to comment that it seems to me that if you're trying to create unity amongst your Western allies, the last thing you want to be doing is slapping them with devastating tariffs and accusing them of cheating just because they have a trade, just because you're in a trade deficit with them. But let's suppose that they manage to corral all of these Western governments together, and they take a unified position against China in this trade war. Do you think that is likely to be an effective strategy and lead ultimately to victory for the Trump administration?
Let me first of all say that this man, you mentioned different buckets when you quoted Trump previously. The idea of buckets comes from this man. He was the one to propose different buckets for tariffs. In other words, you group countries and you put them in different categories of tariffs, depending on how friendly they are or how dangerous they are or whatever they are to the interests of the United States. And what you showed in that clip was basically a further elaboration of that idea. We will put together some countries that are friendly to us, and we're not going to hit them very hard with tariffs and so on, and we will attack the main enemy, which is China, which is also retaliating. He mentioned that point, you see. The others are not retaliating as severely as might have done, and certainly nothing like China. The real trade war then is between the United States and China. That's basically what's happening. And the United States is trying to marshal, as you indicated, all the traditional historic centers of capitalist accumulation behind it. it's not going about it the right way. It hasn't created confidence. It doesn't come across as much of a leader. It doesn't create trust. It has undermined the role of the dollar, which affects just about everybody. And that is a true sign of how mediocre the Trump team is. If that's what they wanted to do, they should have gone about it the wrong way. They shouldn't have let Trump loose on the world scene, imposing tariffs of 10% one day, 25% another day, taking them back, threatening people, doing this, that, and that. If that's how you transact to sell, 3-4 bedroom houses in Brooklyn, that's not how you do international economic negotiations. That's not how it works. If you cut your skills in having deals in constructing towers in Manhattan and selling them, that's not how you operate in the global economic terrain. That's not how you make friends and win influence. In Europe, at any rate, the stock of the US currently is very low. Bessent threatened Europe directly in the clip that you showed, but the options that Europeans have at the moment are not very many. They will have to maintain strong relations with China ahead. So that doesn't bespeak well for the plans that the Trump administration has. I think it's more likely that they will create chaos. They will damage China, but they will damage themselves as well. Again, we can discuss how that would be as we move along.
Yeah. Before we do that, I just I want to pick on, well, first of all, for those who may have forgotten what Bessent said in that clip when Costas referred to the threat. I believe, Costas, what you were talking about was Bessent's use of this rather crude metaphor, that the Spaniards would be cutting their own throat by daring to cozy up to China, the world's industrial powerhouse. I took that also as a threat, Costas, and I thought it was a very crude threat. Again, I don't think this kind of language is likely to engender a sense of unity amongst Europeans and Americans.
No way.
Yeah.
Because you see, from the perspective of Europeans, what's happening at the moment, Europe, you see, one key thing here is economically, Europe doesn't have its own energy sources. Europe is an importer. There is coal, but the move towards clean energy production and so on has limited the significance long-term of coal. So Europe needs to import, and that historically has meant Russia. The geopolitical rift has shifted those sources away from Russia, and that has meant liquefied natural gas. The United States has emerged as a supplier. The United States then is a beneficiary of this transformation because it is a surplus country when it comes to energy, whereas Europe is deficit. The position is very different economically, and that doesn't create much of a basis for joint action. The United States benefits from what's happening. It's exporting energy to Europe and is profiting from it. And Bessent might say that it's our friends over there, but when you're charging our friends enormous amounts of money for energy, they're not very friendly in the longer term. And when you speak in the way in which he does, threatening them, you're not creating the trust that's necessary.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the stakes for China, Costas. Assuming that Trump, there have been moments, I think, when a lot of us thought he was blinking, that he was bluffing, and then he withdrew, but then he comes back again, and even with more aggression than his prior position. We just saw that over the last several days, I think. But let's suppose he persists down this path, and these tariffs stay in place. What do you think the impacts are going to be, broadly speaking, on the People's Republic of China, its economy, and how do you think the government there will try to adapt and mitigate the damage?
Good question. Let's start with what remains so far of the tariffs that Trump and his administration has actually imposed. Because, one loses track. You went through the list before and I got dizzy, as I said to you. So what remains so far? There is a 10% tariff across the board. The base tariff, as it were. That's important for their thinking. And again, we can discuss it. They've imposed that base tariff across the board for everybody. But China has got special treatment. 135, whatever it is. I've lost count of what it is now, right? But it's extortionate, right? So China is the real aim. At the same time, there's still tariffs on aluminum and on steel and on cars. So selective tariffs do apply, and possibly some parts of Chinese output has been excluded from the tariff. Possibly, as we all thought that mobile phones had been excluded because, of course, a lot of the imports into the United States from China are high technology, because China is the workshop of the world, and that damages directly U.S. interests. But anyway, we've got 10% universal tariff and very, very high tariffs for China so far. That's what remains so far. What will happen 90 days from now? Only Trump knows, if he knows, right? So the uncertainty is enormous. So what will that mean? If this tariff war unfolds even more, because China is retaliating and retaliating hard, what will it mean? Here things become complicated, and we need to think very carefully about it. It's one thing to impose fairly modest tariffs, which is what Trump did in 2018, and Biden continued throughout his tenure. People forget that, right? It's one thing to do that, quite another to impose 130%. That's like a different, like a different world. So the hit delivered to Chinese industry, private and to a certain extent public, will be very significant. No question about it. A lot of demand will just disappear. The price increase will be so great that a lot of the demand will just disappear. This will force the Chinese leadership to engage in the social and economic transformation, which has been on the cards for a long time, but they have not been able to deliver because they don't know how to handle it, to be honest. What is that? Well, the good days for China, in other words, the days of rapid economic growth, are over, because wages are not as low as they used to be, the kind of stuff that we mentioned before. Wages have risen. A lot of hundreds of millions of people in China have come out of poverty. Right? And that's one of the successes of China. So real wages have risen. There are far cheaper places in Asia than China, Vietnam being one of them. A lot of Chinese capital has been moving to Vietnam to produce that, and to other countries like that. So the hit of the tariff hit will exacerbate that. It will make the pressure of the high costs even greater. The second thing that will happen is that, associated with that, is that the need to shift away from a model of economic activity that relies on 45% investment, 45% of GDP investment, will have to be changed more rapidly. It's unsustainable. The country doesn't need to invest 45% of its GDP generally in infrastructure and whatever else it is. It needs to improve consumption. It needs to allow the Chinese people to enjoy more of the fruit of their labor and of their increased productivity. Both of these things, however, rising wages and moving towards higher consumption, have got social implications. They're not just economics. These are economic answers one gives, but the social dimensions are very complex. How will you manage rising consumption? Which layers of the population will enjoy higher consumption, which not? How will you manage the tensions that will emerge? These are very difficult things, and Trump is forcing the Chinese Communist Party to confront them. Two more things are very important in this. The first is that if Chinese capital finds that its export markets have become weaker because of the tariffs, and if domestically wages are high or higher than elsewhere, there will be an acceleration of capital outflow from China. Capital will seek to be invested elsewhere. It's a logical thing. Mm-hmm. But the Chinese capital account is under control. It's controlled by the central bank. It's controlled by the states. Tensions will emerge there, substantial tensions, and they will be reflected on the relative value of the yuan, the currency, right? Because the Bank of China manages the yuan on a weekly basis. That's part of the state control. But if capital export needs to increase, that doesn't sit very well with controls and with managing the role of the yuan. They will have to devise a new way of doing monetary policy. That's a very difficult thing, right? And the last thing, the fourth thing that I wanted to mention, is that The pressure on China generated by Trump and his tariffs, the loss of markets, will force the Chinese to move, in a sense, upscale, to improve the technological character of their production, to move towards higher technology. They will invest more. They will increase investment in higher technology even more. They will try and shift into areas in which the United States still retains a comparative advantage. We can expect intensification there. The United States thinks that it has all the aces when it comes to that. That remains to be seen. It remains to be seen. We don't know how it's going to pan out, but we do know they are forcing China to compete more heavily in that field. So all in all, China is under pressure, no question. Its model had come to pretty much an end already. Trump is ratcheting the pressure and is forcing the Chinese leadership to take decisions. The Chinese people can expect ructions ahead. They can expect disturbance. Will America win? Only in Trump's imagination. You don't know how these things are going to turn out.
Right. So I'd like to now show you another clip, this from Trump himself, which I think might provide us with some insight into what the ultimate goal of this madness may be. So let's hear what he had to say in a press conference 2 Mondays ago with the war criminal Netanyahu in the White House.
They cheat like crazy. Canada cheats, Mexico cheats, just one of those things. But we are resetting a table, and we're going to have great trade, and we're going to have a very strong country. Our country is going to be at a level that has maybe never been, or maybe, our country was the strongest, believe it or not, from 1870 to 1913. You know why? It was all tariff-based. We had no income tax. Then in 1913, some genius came up with the idea of let's charge the people of our country, not foreign countries that are ripping off our country.
So the United States was the greatest country on God's green earth, according to the Donald, when it had no income tax. So I heard this and a big, alarm bell started ringing in my head. And it's not the first time he said something like this, of course, Costas. I suspect that this has a lot to do with the Donald wanting to eliminate income tax on himself and his billionaire buddies. So my first question to you is, how much do you think, and I guess you're sort of, it's kind of an unfair question because none of us can read the Donald's mind and it would be terrifying to even try. But I wonder, is that really what this is all about? Is that a large part of the motivation based on the totality of the evidence? And secondly, what do you think this would do to the United States if they actually moved back to a model, which I haven't actually confirmed this, but according to Trump, prior to 1913, the revenues of the United States government were tariff-based and there was no income tax. What do you think this would do to the finances and to the society if, in fact, he were to achieve that goal?
I mean, how does one begin to make head or tail of all that? One thing that has to be said is that Trump, as he did during his first tenure, but for this one, he's promised us from the beginning that he was going to cut taxes and he was going to deregulate, quite apart from tariffs. He said, he promised that he will cut taxes even more and he will deregulate. And that's why the Wall Street and everybody else, and even the big CEOs, liked him when he was contesting the presidency. So we know that he's a firm believer in cutting taxes for himself and his friends, basically, and his social group. We know that he's hoping to achieve that. Again, we can discuss what this means more broadly. But on income tax, and there you get a true sense of how wild these people are. Income tax was invented by the English during the Napoleonic Wars. It's one of the major innovations in the history of capitalism because it allows for a steady flow of revenue for the state. It provides the state with a reliable revenue that doesn't depend on excise or on tariffs and so on. And therefore, it allows the state to intervene in a systematic way in organizing capitalist production, the capitalist economy. The idea that the United States was great because it relied on tariffs, it only exists in Trump's disorganized mind. During that period that he's talking about, when the United States emerged as a major power, he should also know the United States had a financial system that was reasonably controlled. That was close connection between big business and big banks, and it was a system that was not market-based, as it then financial system that was not market-based as it then became. That was reminiscent of many developing countries against which he is now battling, because the United States at that time was also a developing country, and that was far more important than this nonsense about tariffs and no income tax and so on. Now, if he attempted to do that, indeed, however, in other words, abolish income tax and somehow survive on tariff revenues, that would probably be the end of the United States as a hegemonic power. That will immediately disorganize and shrink the states. It will result in a state machine that is already dysfunctional, as we know. The U.S. state machine is already dysfunctional. Elon Musk is making it even more dysfunctional. If we go into a state in which income tax is abolished and the United States relies only on tariff income, then you can forget any notion of the United States dominating the world economy and being the major superpower. He doesn't know what he's talking about. It's a simple. He doesn't know what he's talking about. The most charitable thing that can be said about it is this: he and his acolytes, his circle of friends, realize that the current fiscal position of the United States government is untenable. He realizes that. He realizes that the deficit of roughly 7% of GDP and a public debt in the tens of trillions, 35, whatever $1 trillion it is, that's unsustainable. He realizes that. But the idea that this can be cured by abolishing income tax, relying on tariff income, and therefore reducing expenditure and so on, shows how little they understand of the modern state and the modern. It's impossible to do. It's impossible, and if they engage in a policy of this type, they will cause enormous damage and disturbance to the U.S. economy.
Right. Now, getting back again to what the theoretical basis of this tariff war is, I thought it was important for us to discuss today, Costas, an individual who is perceived by many to be the brains, and I use that word advisedly, behind Trump's tariff scheme, and that is Stephen Moran, who is the chair of his Council of Economic Advisors. Last November, when Moran was the senior strategist of Hudson Bay Capital, he authored a paper entitled A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System. Now, I imagine you're familiar with this paper, and I'm curious to know, could you summarize first for us, what is the thrust of his argument in this paper, Moran's argument, and what is your assessment of that argument?
In some ways, you can hear echoes of Moran's paper in the clip you showed me of Trump just a minute ago. The idea that Canada, Mexico, everybody else is cheating like mad in their transactions with the United States. You can hear echoes of that paper. Moran doesn't put it that way, but that's where Trump gets the, in a sense, the analytical, insofar as it exists, backing for this. So what's the position? It's important to understand that, because if there is any kind of economic analysis behind what Trump and his administration are doing, this is it, right? Insofar as we know what they've made available to us. So the paper that you referred to, I want to be charitable, right? I want to be as generous as I possibly can. The paper that you refer to starts with an observation which is true, that the global trade system, and therefore the financial system attached to the trade system, is problematic. It starts with that the system doesn't deliver what we would want it to deliver. It's problematic. Some of us on the non-mainstream economics tradition, the radical tradition or the critical tradition, have been saying this for many years, that the global financial and trade architecture is problematic from top to bottom, right? That's what this paper also says openly, right? But then it proceeds to say that the main loser out of this, the main damage from this problematic system is done to the United States. It's the complete opposite of what the critics of the global system have been saying for many years. Because, I, in my work, and others like me have been saying the system doesn't work, the architecture is problematic, and the losers are developing countries which are on the periphery of the world system, which are burdened with losses and difficult and impossible way of entering the world market, which is basically geared against them. Moran is saying the opposite. The loser apparently is the United States. Now, take a step back and think of how absurd this is. The major power that established this system, because it's the United States that created it, right, somehow has become the victim of it. And why is it the victim of it? Because the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. That's the diagnosis. The diagnosis is completely wrong, right? Moran's thinking is the system malfunctions, and it malfunctions because the dollar is the reserve currency, and the dollar being the reserve currency means that the dollar has got a very high value because foreigners, China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, a whole host of countries hold reserves of dollars. Therefore, they demand it, and they keep its value high by doing so. But if the value of the dollar is high, says Moran, then United States industry cannot compete. It is basically outcompeted out of the global markets. And that, he thinks, is the efficient cause of the loss of manufacturing capacity by the United States and the loss of industrial jobs, the industrial devastation that we all know has happened in so many states in the United States. So that's basically the diagnosis. What's the cure? The cure has two sides. First is tariffs. So you get the theory of tariffs that we've seen somehow applied by Trump. Except that Moran couldn't quite possibly expect that what we're going to get is the Donald changing the level of tariffs every 5 minutes. So basically, the argument there was a 10% universal tariff, such as we now have, high tariffs against China, and then we will see about the others, possibly the buckets that Besant referred to in the clip that you showed before, right? Tariffs of this type, he thinks, would be very effective in beginning to redress the damage caused by the high dollar in his thinking. That's one part. The second part of the cure is, of course, currency intervention. And why? Because obviously Trump, and to a certain extent Moran, although he doesn't discuss it, realize that it isn't just a problem for the United States that the dollar is the world currency. It might also be a benefit. He doesn't tell us what these benefits might be, but he seems to say, or he tells us openly, that Trump, for some reason, wants to maintain the dollar as the world reserve currency. But then you've got an issue here. If you want to bring the dollar down to improve the competitiveness of US manufacturing, but also you want to keep the dollar as the world reserve currency, why would anybody keep the dollar if they are foreigners trading with the United States? Why would anybody want to hold on to a currency that declines in value and lose money? Because that's basically what it entails. And here we get lunacy on a grand scale. The answer apparently is to change the composition of the reserves. and the type of asset that the foreigners hold. So how do you manufacture the fall in the dollar from the currency side? You make the foreigner, Saudi Arabia, China, sell the dollar, get rid of some of their reserves. Therefore, that will bring the value of the dollar down. United States will benefit, presumably. And how do you make them continue to abide by the dollar as a reserve currency? You change the composition. Instead of holding short-term treasuries, you make them hold long-term bonds. They switch to long-term bonds. They hold long-term bonds. If they hold long-term bonds, then they continue to hold the dollar, and the rate of interest, the yield of the dollar, doesn't collapse. Doesn't do what the problematic thing that would have been caused if they just sold. So you win. But why would the foreigner, the question naturally arises, continue to hold dollars longer term when the value declines? Because the loss is enormous. Why would China do that? Says Moran and his friends, because that will be the price for the security protection provided by the United States. That will be a cost that the participants in the world market will have to accept as the price of the U.S. The security expenditure, and that will be the way of participating in the security costs. That will be their way of sharing the security expenditure and defense. Now, you might ask, who is China seeking security against? The Americans, of course, because the Americans. But that aside, you can see that is the strongest, apparently, economic argument that can come from that side. It really is the C team. It really is the C team. It really is people who understand that the system malfunctions, but don't understand why it malfunctions. And the reason why they don't understand that is because they approach it from the standpoint of the United States, which is the main beneficiary of this system. And they think that somehow it's the loser. And whatever happens must continue to rebound in the interests of the United States. In other words, they're going to make the system even worse than it is at the moment. The system needs changing, for sure, not in that direction, not at all in that direction. We need a system that allows countries to trade equitably, and we need a system that creates some kind of reserve currency, right, that doesn't benefit the United States as extraordinarily as he has done so far. We need to control the financial system. On that, Moran, his friends, Trump, and his friends have got next to nothing to say. Nothing.
Right.
Because you don't control the financial system. You impose tariffs on China. That's how you solve the problem. No, you don't solve the problem.
Quite apart from the fact that this sounds a lot like The Godfather. So, yeah, this seems like a particularly inopportune time to be touting the protection the United States offers. We're seeing in real time, and tragically, how that's working out for Ukraine. This is the result of the U.S. protection, the destruction of the country. In any event, Costas, always a fascinating discussion. I'd like to give, we've now been going for about an hour, I'd like to give our audience members an opportunity to ask some questions. And although, we've been focused on the tariffs and so forth, I don't want people to feel as though they have to confine their questions to that subject. If there's some other matter of relating to economic policy, geopolitics that you'd like to hear us address, please write your comments in the chat. And I'll be keeping an eye out for them. Again, really any subject in the geopolitical sphere is open, fair game in our discussion. And while I'm waiting for some questions to come in, Costas, I did want to ask you one other question about the reaction of the left in Europe to Trump's tariff war. How do you assess, I mean, to the extent that the left has anything to say about this subject nowadays in Europe, I really haven't seen anything other than, talk about retaliatory tariffs, any kind of coherent plan. Do you, what is your view about this? As someone who, decidedly from the left, and you're a European and want to see, the vitality, the economic vitality of the continent restored, enhanced. What do you think Europe's reaction ought to be?
The left is very confused, not just in Europe, more generally in the United States too, from what I can gather. To me, two things are very, very important here. The first is the left is not in favor of free trade. A lot of people confuse that. They think that the lunacy of what Trump is doing and the damage he's imposing on the U.S. economy and elsewhere needs to be opposed by the left, saying, no, we're against tariffs. No. Tariffs are a legitimate instrument of economic policy. The left is for controlled trade, not for free trade. Neoliberals are for free trade, extreme neoliberals. But of course, tariffs must be measured, and they must be part of a broader economic strategy, not this chaos that we see. But that is often not understood. And what you get is some weird defenses of the current system, which is clearly dysfunctional. Trump is right to point his finger at the dysfunctionality of the current system. So weird defenses of that in order to stand up to Trump. No, if Trump is saying it, he must be wrong. No, he knows that Trump knows that the system doesn't work. He just doesn't know how to fix it, and the fixes he proposes are often worse than the disease. So that is not really understood by the left, and that's a sign of the weakness of the left, right? And that's why discussions of this type are important, I think, in focus points.
So let's go to, there are actually two questions along the same lines. Also, Arsenal in the chat posed a similar question to ALM, which I put up on the screen. Were the tariffs market manipulation, quick bucks for friends on Wall Street, or is this economic isolation preparatory to conflict with China? And before you answer, Costas, I just want to point out that at some point during this mayhem, Trump went on social media and said this is an excellent buying opportunity, which I think created a lot of suspicion. I would think, as a securities lawyer, something I did for most of my career, that this, those who have knowledge of what Trump's immediate intentions may be, what announcement is coming out next, because these announcements have such a tremendous impact on stock prices and bond prices and so forth, this would be an extraordinary opportunity for insider trading. Whether it's happening or not, I don't know. But I'm curious, have you seen any indication that there is, the C team is exploiting, or friends of the Trump administration are exploiting these market gyrations that are being created by the mayhem?
I have no evidence to that effect, but I, like you, I would expect insider trading here, particularly when he introduced the freeze for 90 days and the stock market went through the roof for a day. There's no question. I mean, I'd be prepared to take a big bet that some of his friends made a fortune out of this. They would have known. But on the question, it's the latter part. This is not so much economic isolation, but preparation for a conflict with China, which is economic in the first instance, but also political and increasingly military. It's not a quick buck for friends on Wall Street. Actually, Wall Street lost. And that was the ostensible reason for his retreat, for his 90-day freeze. And that was also an indication of what I mentioned before, that all this analysis left the financial system out of account, and then it turned around and bit them on their backside. Because you see, I mean, I want to simplify it. There's a complex financial game being played here by the hedge funds. For about 2 years now, the difference between the yield, the rate on US government debt and other debt, especially by foreigners, has been getting smaller because the policy of the Federal Reserve gradually is to bring down the interest rates in the United States, and that made that spread progressively smaller between the US bond rate and foreign rates and other rates. Hedge funds had taken a bet that With Trump coming to power, this will continue to be the case. And so they had taken a bet that the spread will continue to contract because the yield in the United States will continue to decline. Trump introduces these wild measures, panic sets in, or serious concern sets in the United States financial markets about what is this guy doing, right? And foreigners also begin to worry for large institutions, and they offload U.S. public debt. They offload it. Well, if you offload U.S. public debt, the yield will go up. The yield will rise. So if you've taken a bet that the yield will remain the same, will decline, you're going to get losses. And his friends, insofar as he got friends in the hedge funds, got burned. That's basically what forced the issue, the panic, offloading U.S. bonds, U.S. public bonds, and causing hedge funds to lose money and force them to freeze, to stop the policies for 90 days in order to give a breathing space to hedge funds. That tells you what the real cause is of U.S. decline in the last 30 years. It's not the high dollar because the foreigners are buying dollars or keeping dollars as reserve. It's the financialization of the U.S. economy and the weakening of large corporations which have become financialized themselves. And every time there's a policy that might begin to challenge that, finance intervenes and defends its interests. That's what's happened here. So really, it's preparation of contest with China, not really facilitating his friends to make a fast buck on Wall Street, unless there are some individuals who exploited the insider trading. But the financial system as a whole got burned out of this. Hence the retreat.
Right. Now, another question we have coming in, it just seemed to have misplaced it, but it's one of our audience members asked you for your views on the Mara Lago Accord. And my understanding of this accord is that it's essentially encapsulated in Moran's paper. But what is your understanding of the Mara Lago Accord, and what are your thoughts about that, Costas?
It's exactly what I said before. You're right. It's Moran's paper. That insofar as we've got a clear understanding or a clear formulation of this, it's basically what I suggested before, which is not coherent for reasons that I've explained. But let me put that in broader context so that we know what we're talking about. A lot of talk has been put across the international media after Trump introduced his tariffs to the effect that he's destroying a system that has been in existence for 75 years, 85 years. Journalists went back to the end of the Second World War. That's not true, right? The 30 years from the end of World War II to 1975 were one period. That's, broadly speaking, Bretton Woods one, right? The real Bretton Woods period, where exchange rates were pretty much fixed. And the reason why they were fixed is because the US dollar, which was the pivot of the system, was convertible into gold at $35 to the troy ounce. Not for everybody. You couldn't go to the central bank and ask for your dollars to be changed into gold. But if you were a country trading with the United States, then your central bank presumably had the right to ask the US central bank for the dollars that he had accumulated to be converted into the commodity money, gold. So gold in a key way acted as the pivot of the system and stabilized exchange rates within reason. Mm-hmm. That came to an end, mostly because the United States increased its fiscal deficit because of the Vietnam War. Inflation set in. It became impossible for the United States to maintain the convertibility. So convertibility was lifted and went into a period of flexible exchange rates and, crucially, free and easy capital movement. You could take your money from one country and take it to another. The Bretton Woods system was a system of controlled capital movements, which was a key way in which exchange rates were fixed. In the new system, exchange rates were flexible. The dollar was not convertible into anything, and you could take your money freely from one country and take it to another. In dribs and drabs, the United States then emerged as the new pivot of that. And that was part of the unipolar moment eventually. In other words, you had a situation in which the United States domestic currency, the dollar, which was inconvertible into anything else, a dollar is a dollar because the United States says it's a dollar, became the world money, the point of reference for everybody. Now, it doesn't take long to appreciate the strength, the power that this gives to the United States, because it's domestic currency becomes the global money, and its domestic central bank, the Federal Reserve, in effect, becomes the central bank that can manage monetary policy, or at least affect monetary policy globally. It is the exorbitant privilege of the United States. It is a part of its hegemonic power and influence. That system is now impossible. He has run its course. And that became very clear in 2022 with the Ukraine war, when the United States imposed sequestration essentially on Russian reserves of dollars. It became very clear that there was no freedom in how these reserves would be used. They were a weapon on the part of the United States. That was, in a sense, the bell that rang, and people began to realize things have changed. On top of that, what has also changed is that the ability of the United States to back Bretton Woods II, which lasted from 1975 to 2022, was attenuated. The industrial strength of the United States declined. The economy became financialized. The productivity of labor stopped increasing. And America began to spend more than it produced. It began to create permanent current account deficits, which meant that its debt to foreigners went through the roof. That became incredibly pronounced during the Biden administration. It's very, very important to remember that. In 2020, when the pandemic hit, Biden went mad with this, right? And the US debt and money creation went through the roof. That made Bretton Woods II unmanageable. The Mara Lago discussions, the Mara Lago Accord discussions, insofar as they are discussions, and God knows what they've been discussing over there, are basic initial attempts to begin to construct a Bretton Woods III. That's basically what's happening, right? But if they're trying to do it, and if they attempt to do it in the way in which Moran argues, they will fail. And they will fail because you start with a system which was geared towards serving the interests of the United States, maintaining its preeminence. You start with a system like that, you assume that actually it was negative for the United States when it was positive. It was negative for everybody else. I mean, if you're the finance minister of Zambia, or the finance minister of Tanzania, or the finance minister of Argentina, the idea that the system previously was in favor of you and against the United States is for laughs, right? You start with that wrong idea, and then you try to make it even worse. It will never work. Yes, we do need new arrangement. Yes, we do need a new system. Yes, we do need something, but not in that way. And if the United States cannot deliver it, which it cannot right now, then we're entering a period of instability. We're entering a period in which there will be contestation. And here, it's all bets are off. We don't know which direction he will take it.
Right.
It's unclear.
Right. So our next question is outside the realm of tariffs and economic matters in particular, but it's one that I'd like to address, Costas, because it's a subject that I have as they put it, a bee in my bonnet about this. Who is the head of the snake? Love Guru asks. America or Israel's Zionist? I assume the word entity is missing, but in any event, and the reason why I want to answer this question, Costas, is because I hear far too much suggestion, in my opinion, my humble opinion, that the Israel controls American foreign policy in the Middle East, which I must say, I know this is a widely held view, and with all due respect to those who hold it, I find it preposterous. And I operate on the assumption that the people who control policy are the ones who have the leverage, and the United States has enormous leverage over Israel. Without the $4 billion annually of U.S. military aid, the protection that the United States extends to Israel in international fora, for example, exercising its veto power in the UN Security Council, the economic aid it has provided to Israel. Israel is the largest recipient of foreign aid in the world, U.S. foreign aid since its founding. Israel couldn't exist, not in its current form. It literally depends for its very existence upon the goodwill of the ruling elite in the United States. And so I am firmly in the camp of Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, the former chief of staff of Colin Powell, who has expressed this repeatedly from an insider's point of view. He was in the upper echelons of the U.S. government during the Bush administration. He ascribes to the same view as I do, that it is the United States that calls the shots, and that Israel is effectively America's rabid dog in this oil-rich region. Of course, on the other side of this debate, there is John Mearsheimer, perhaps most, who believes that the power of the Israel lobby is so great that it can even bring the president of the United States to heel. I'm curious to know if you have a view about this, Costas. So where do you fall in this debate?
I respect both views, right? And both the people who express them for different reasons. Mearsheimer is a very an authority on this kind of realism. I've read his books. I've got some time for it, although his analysis of superpower contestation is not rooted in the economics. And the position I take is that, yes, superpowers contest hegemony, but ultimately it's actually economics underneath that fight for contestation. Economic entities that contest for hegemony. But that aside, Wilkerson has been an inside person, so you better respect what he's saying. He's seen it from the inside. I like to think of that, what's happening in the Middle East and Israel in particular, which is a most peculiar relationship with the United States. It has to be said, whichever position you take, there is no other country that's got this connection with the United States. I'd like to think of it in terms of the overall battle for hegemony at the moment and for defense of American imperialism across the world. It cannot be seen in isolation. Essentially, right now, we've got three main areas of contestation for that across the world. There is Ukraine, Russia, and so on, what's been happening there. There is China and Taiwan, but also the economics. And there is the Middle East, which involves Israel, but also oil, of course, in there. These are the three main areas of, in a sense, imperial and hegemonic contest in the world. The Israeli-US position relationship cannot be seen in isolation from the other two. It has to be understood in total. If you do it in total, then it's clear that the dominant player is the United States. The idea that the dominant player is Israel, and what the Americans are doing in foreign policy generally is dictated by Netanyahu is not a good argument. You've got to see it in total. The dominant player, the dog, is the United States in the Middle East, as it is elsewhere. However, in the Middle East, that particular tail has got exceptional power. It's a very unusual tail, it has to be said, and it does have an influence on the dog which no one else does, and that has to do with the domestic power of the Israeli lobby. There's no question that has to do with that, and you can see it across the board. And Mearsheimer has contributed greatly to our understanding. I don't, without siding fully with what he says, there's no question that he's put his finger on something true. So you start with U.S. imperialism. You start with its interests. This is where it's coming from. It's actually defending its hegemonic position and its economic interests, controlling energy flows, controlling energy resources, controlling, how oil and other resources will go, and controlling global balance of powers. And then you place Israel in that, which has got its own agenda, which at times it can clash with the Americans, which at times it can push the Americans in peculiar directions. Yes, that's the power of the Israeli lobby. But the dominant player is the U.S. elite. Now, having said this, much of it will depend on what the US elite looks like. And I have to say, the US elite, the capitalist ruling class in the United States, in the last several years, has not given us evidence of good quality. The team around Biden was second rate. At the moment, they're beginning to make the team around Trump look like, it's amazing. I mean, how the decline in quality is amazing. In that context, the Israelis have got more leverage and more ability to maneuver and manipulate. And that's what we're seeing to a certain extent. That's what we're seeing.
You know, I just a week ago had this same discussion with Shir Hever, who is an Israeli expat, strong supporter of the Palestinian cause and economic researcher. And for what it's worth, he concurred with me. I must say that I used to be of the Mearsheimer school, and my views have changed over the past 3 years. But I just want to point out that something did happen in the U.S.-Israeli relationship, which supports my thesis that it's America that's in control, and that is that, you know, when I showed you that clip, Costas, of Trump sitting in the White House, as I mentioned, Netanyahu was to his right. And one of the reasons why Netanyahu came on short notice to Washington was that Trump imposed significant tariffs on Israel. And those tariffs, according to the Israeli Manufacturers Association, were going to cause billions of dollars of damage, you know, to Israel's relatively small economy. And the reports are that that Netanyahu didn't get what he wanted out of that meeting, that for the time being, at any rate, the U.S. tariffs on Israel are going to remain in place. So for what it's worth, I think that's at least some evidence that supports the America's the dog thesis.
There's no question. America is a dog, Israel is a tail. But as I said, it's a very strange tale, right? It's one that can do things which no one else can do, and that's the U.S. The Israeli lobby in the US, quite clearly. No one else has got remotely the same influence in domestic US policy as does Israel, it's clear. And a lot of countries aspire to it, incidentally, but they cannot achieve it for reasons that have to do with history. That's how it is.
Right.
And disastrous it is for the people of the Middle East.
Right. Well, as always, a great pleasure speaking with you, Costas, and I look forward to our next discussion. Those of you who follow us closely but do not subscribe, please do so. We've seen some tremendous growth in our subscriber base. This program has been going for about a year, and we're now up to about 68,000 subscribers. And our goal is to hit over 100,000 by the end of the year. And with your support, I'm sure we can do that. If you haven't liked the video, please do so. And we are thinking of probably going to hold a live stream on Friday after the leaders' debates in the Canadian election with myself and Eve Engler and Alex Terrell. And if you can join us then, we'd be happy to speak to you. So for now, we're signing off, and Costas, take care and peace out, everybody.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. Pleasure to talk to you.
Bye.